Hello everyone. 2400 years ago was born one of the greatest conquerors in history, a man who changed the world he was born into. And tonight we're going to explore his life, his time, the relevance of his actions, and why his name, Alexander the Great, sounds almost more legendary than real, or why it became the touchstone against which many other conquerors or military leaders would be appraised. So please make yourself comfortable. We have a long story ahead of us. You may sit down or lie down. All you have to do is let me tell you the story. If you wish to have more of this channel or support it, please consider joining my Patreon page. It gives you perks like downloads, advanced releases, tracks with background sounds, surveys. Actually, this topic was voted for by my patrons, and so will be the next one about the colonization of the moon. And on Patreon you also contribute to keep this channel free of sponsors and with as little advertising as possible. And now, let's get started. We are in 356 BC, in the kingdom of Macedon, or Macedonia, and Alexander was born in Pella, its capital, from King Philip II and one of his wives, Olympias, a princess from the kingdom of Epirus. His mother would turn out to be an important influence on him, and would play a political role later, during his conquests, as she would become the effective ruler of the kingdom in the absence of her son. Historically, Macedon was a fairly small kingdom that was part of the Greek world, but on its fringes, in its periphery. It had formed during the archaic Greek period. You know that when we talk of archaic and classical Greece, we refer to different periods set by historians. Archaic Greece is from the 8th to the 5th centuries BC, and it is a period of renewal for the Greeks. After a long period of stagnation called the Greek Dark Ages, that had followed the collapse of the Mycenaean civilization in Greece by the end of the 2nd millennium BC, the Greeks recover. They undergo big changes. The famous city-states of ancient Greece appear, cities grow again, the population increases strongly, technology improves, and the Greeks start to settle around the Mediterranean Sea or the Black Sea. This term, archaic, may be a bit misleading, because it suggests maybe underdevelopment or something vaguely prehistoric. But in reality, archaic Greece is a period of recovery, of rebirth almost. It is a time when Greek literature, thought, art flourish, the time of Homer and Hesiod. It is called archaic, mostly in contrast with the 5th and 4th centuries BC, a classical period that comes just after. Classical Greece is considered a separate period, first because it is a historically very dense period of time, including many rivalries and wars between Greek states, and against their greatest enemy, the Achaemenid Empire, Persians. But there is more than that. Classical Greece is also 2 centuries of extraordinary development in thought, art, and science. Philosophy, political concepts, architecture, sculpture, as well as mathematics, engineering, the scientific examination of everything, or at least the attempt to do it. The intense creativity and the legacy of the classical period for Mediterranean cultures and what will be called Western culture is huge. Of course, a lot would happen after, but this heritage lives on. And Alexander was born by the end of this classical period. Actually, his preceptor, until he was 16, would be Aristotle, one of the many prominent thinkers of the period. But I told you, Macedon was at the periphery of Greece. When we speak of archaic and classical Greece, we generally refer to what happened in the very heart of the Greek world. That corresponds to central and southern Greece today. A fairly small region, dense in population and cities, but it really isn't much on the map. And an area Macedon was not a part of. The Macedonians were an ancient Greek tribe, but they lived and expanded on the northern edge of this Greek heartland, at the expense of non-Greeks like the Thracians and the Illyrians. Even though they were very influenced by Greek culture, they spoke a different dialect of Greek, a sister language, ancient Macedonian, and the influence of archaic and even more classical Greece is obvious in their architecture, their worldview. Their economy was also connected to the south, or the prestige language in Macedon, the language of higher education, diplomacy, or literature, during the classical period was Attic Greek, the form of Greek spoken in Attica, the region of Athens. The ancient Macedonians formed a small kingdom in the 7th century BC, a state that was independent from the powerful city-states of the time, cities like Thebes, Sparta, or Athens, the prominent powers of the classical period. So, seen from the south, Macedon looked like a half-Greek kingdom. It was a bit barbarian too, with its different language and traditions, and not a very relevant military power neither. What didn't help its prestige was that in the late 6th century BC, Macedon submitted voluntarily to the Persians, to the Achaemenid Empire, about which we're going to talk a lot tonight. The Achaemenid Empire was by far the largest, most populated, and powerful empire of the time. From Persia, it had expanded in all directions, to the point of becoming a neighbor of the Greeks by the 6th century BC. Emperor Cyrus the Great had conquered Lydia, on the other side of the Aegean Sea, in Anatolia, modern Turkey, which had already brought culturally Greek city-states in Turkey under Persian control. His successor, Darius I, continued the conquest and added Thrace, in the south of the Balkans, to the empire. Macedon was at risk of being crushed by the incomparably larger Achaemenid forces. So its king at the time, Amyntas I, preferred to submit, and become a vassal of the Achaemenid Empire, which allowed him to retain his throne and keep a degree of autonomy. Now that Macedon is on the side of the Persians, they are expected to provide troops, and they do when the Achaemenids attack the rest of Greece with the intention to absorb it. Thanks to an alliance of its main states and quite extraordinary military exploits, the Greeks resist two attempts at invading them, attempts in which the Macedonians are on the side of the Persians, so they don't gain much respect from the Greeks. The failure of the second Persian invasion of Greece in 480 and 479 BC is when conventionally the line between archaic and classical Greece is drawn. After this second failure, the Achaemenid Empire stays very close. It controls Anatolia and will keep it until the rise of Alexander, 125 years later. But now it is more on the defensive, and the Persians are even forced to withdraw from mainland Europe. Macedon gets its full independence back and stops paying regular tributes or contributing troops to the Persians. In the 5th and 4th centuries BC, the decades before the birth of Alexander, Macedon has an eventful history of alliances and wars, rebellions, succession wars, and threats of invasion coming from its non-Greek neighbors to the north and the west. It goes to war several times with Athens in the 5th century BC, and it preserves its independence but doesn't do much progress until Alexander's father, Philip II of Macedon, rises to the throne in 359 BC. We are now 3 years before Alexander's birth. Philip II eliminates rival pretenders, he makes peace with his neighbors, and takes advantage of this respite to radically reform the Macedonian army. He changes everything: organization, equipment, training, and tactics, introducing an infantry formation called the Macedonian phalanx. Let's spend a minute on it, because this Macedonian phalanx would be a formation of choice in the future battles of Alexander. So what is a phalanx? It is the infantry formation the Greeks of the period used in pitched battles, a rectangular mass of fighters acting as one entity on the battlefield, armed with long spears or pikes, and defended with shields, all standardized. The phalanx would advance as a dense wall, with the first rows of soldiers pointing their long spears at their opponents, making them hard to touch, at least from the front or without ranged weapons. The following rows of fighters would push to contain the pressure against the front of the phalanx, and stay ready to replace their companions should they fall. So a typical infantry battle of the archaic and classical periods between two Greek powers would pitch phalanxes facing each other, trying to rout their opponents with their staying power, or to outflank them, because the sides and the back of the phalanx were weaker. It was all about maneuver, and when the spears and shields came into contact, group cohesion and individual courage to stay in formation at any cost. If a phalanx disaggregated, and not its enemy, it had lost. The soldiers forming phalanxes from the 7th to the 4th centuries BC were called hoplites. They were citizen soldiers, heavily armored, not the only type of troops the Greeks placed on battlefields. They also had bowmen or cavalry, but hoplites formed the backbone of Greek armies. Now there are not that many ways of forming a phalanx with soldiers armed of shields and spears. So what made this new Macedonian phalanx different and more powerful? First, their weapons. Greek hoplites used a 6 to 9 feet spear, that's about 2 to 3 meters, that they held in one hand, the other arm holding the shield. Of course, when you have to fight using this phalanx formation, the first thing you think about is that you want the longest spears possible, so that you can strike the enemy before they can reach you. But this is limited by the weight of the equipment. The spears have to be held very firmly and horizontally. They cannot point to the ground, otherwise the wall of spears will be weak. But on top of the spears, soldiers also have to carry heavy armor, especially their shields. So this limits the possible weight and therefore the length of the spears. Philip II changes this by deliberately lightening the equipment, the armor, and also the shield, which becomes strapped to the forearm in the Macedonian phalanx. So it frees the second hand, and he takes advantage of this second hand and less weight to elongate the spear. He replaces the 6 to 9 feet spear by a very long pike called the sarissa, measuring 16 to 22 feet or 5 to 7 meters, that soldiers held with their two hands. So they had a very firm grip of their sarissas, and given how long it was, the second, third, fourth rows of soldiers in the phalanx could also point their pikes at the enemy, at different angles, forming like a giant porcupine with pikes. For staying power, and in order to maximize the number of pikes, the Macedonian phalanx also has more ranks. The typical Greek phalanx had 8 to 12 rows of soldiers. The Macedonian one increases that number to 16 and sometimes 32. And finally, these new Macedonian phalanxes are not just about equipment and formation. Philip II also changes their role and how they interact with other arms. The Greek phalanx was often expected to win battles by itself, on sheer staying power and discipline. The Macedonian version is part of a broader system, a combined arms system. It is supposed to be used to pin the enemy, while on top of the phalanx's might, cavalry will deliver attacks on the flanks and the rear, thanks to its mobility. I am detailing all this because these tactics would be used by the armies of Alexander, and the importance of his father's reign should not be minimized. Alexander inherited a war machine and a kingdom that had become powerful enough to subdue the rest of the Greek world, even before he rose to the throne. Because under Philip II, Macedon is on the rise. Through war and diplomacy, he dramatically expands the might and influence of his kingdom. He doesn't annex the main independent cities of Greece, but he forces them into treaties that make him the leader of almost all of Greece. This culminates in 338 BC, when Alexander is 18, and in 2 years he will succeed his father. So in 338 BC, Philip II defeats the old powers of Athens and Thebes. These two cities had built a coalition of southern Greek states to try and reverse the domination of Macedon over all of Greece, and they fail completely. Philip is able to impose a settlement that makes all states of southern Greece, except Sparta, his allies. He creates a federation called the League of Corinth, or the Hellenic League, that puts Greece firmly under his control for a more ambitious project. He plans on embarking in an attack on the Achaemenid Empire, in order to at least get back these formerly Greek areas in western Anatolia. Because in those years, as he was expanding his influence in Greece, Philip was also fighting the Persians for the control of Thrace, northeast of Greece, and he wanted to escalate that conflict as the head of a coalition of all the Greek states. He couldn't do it because in 336 BC, aged 46, he is assassinated by a bodyguard. This leads to the immediate succession of his son, Alexander, who would go on to proceed with the invasion plan with incredible success. So, who is this young man, aged 20, who ascends to the throne after his very successful father? A lot of legends were invented about his early years because of his future accomplishments, or maybe at his instigation. So it is not always easy to distinguish facts from fiction. What we know is that he is born in a small but rather prosperous kingdom at a time when his father is on the rise as a young king. So he receives the education of a Greek prince. You remember, Macedon was culturally very influenced by classical Greece, even though it was a bit at the periphery of the Greek heartland. This includes intellectual and artistic education, reading, writing, playing music instruments, and physical education, riding, fighting, hunting. When he is 10 years old, his father buys him a horse that Alexander names Bucephalus, meaning ox head, and he bounds with this horse that would accompany and carry him on his campaigns as far as India. When he is 13, Philip looks for a tutor for his son and considers various scholars before choosing Aristotle, who comes from Athens. Aristotle was born in the north of Greece, but he had later joined Plato's Academy in Athens, a very prestigious institution, and he had stayed there for almost 20 years before moving to Macedon at the request of Philip II. So that made Aristotle a perfect and prestigious representative of Athenian academic philosophy and science. He was curious, analytical, interested in multiple fields from natural sciences to politics to philosophy, or even economics and psychology. More than half the writings of Aristotle are considered lost, But what remains is already a huge sum of his thinking and classical Greek thought. At this time, as an adolescent, Alexander is not schooled alone, face to face with his tutor. He is educated with other adolescents of his generation, the children of Macedonian nobles, many of which become friends and future companions, future generals. People like Ptolemy, who will found the Ptolemaic kingdom in Egypt, Hephaestion, certainly his closest friend and confidant, possibly lover, at least later authors have speculated on this. In any case, they would remain very close until the death of Hephaestion would separate them, plunging Alexander in a state of deep grief. Their wives were sisters too, and Hephaestion would become his second in command during their campaigns. Yet another companion was Cassander, who would reign over Macedon for 20 years after Alexander's death. And there are others. In their school with Aristotle, that works like a kind of boarding school for young nobles, Alexander is taught about many fields: philosophy, history, morals, logic, medicine, art, also mythology and literature. He would have developed a passion for the works of Homer, the Iliad and the Odyssey, that he knew very well. And we can imagine a teenager dreaming of heroic deeds, ancient wars, or bigger-than-life figures from these mythological stories. His education is very Greek, very Athenian in particular. But being in Macedon, he also has an exposure to the reality of their very mighty neighbor, the Achaemenid Empire. Relations between Macedon and the Achaemenids are openly hostile when he grows up, and the court of Philip II receives people in exile from the Persian Empire. Alexander is acquainted with several of them, and this probably opens his eyes on the much wider world that exists beyond Greece. Even with the domination of Greece that his father has established when Alexander is a child, Macedon is still not that much in the grand scheme of things in the eyes of the Persians. At most, a peripheral enemy among others, for a Persian empire that is dozens of times larger. The territories of the Achaemenids stretch from Anatolia to India, or Central Asia to Egypt. At 16, Alexander starts to take big responsibilities. His time with Aristotle ends, and his father leaves him in charge of Macedon as a regent in his absence, while he is involved in a campaign against the Thracians. 16 sounds very young, but at the time it was a normal age for future leaders to transition into adulthood. In antique societies, the time dedicated to childhood and adolescence was shorter than today. Actually, adolescence was not necessarily acknowledged as an age in someone's life, as a period with specific challenges and learnings. Children turned into adults. There was a cultural dimension to this, but also a practical one. The life expectancy of a child at birth is something like 25 in antiquity. If a newborn survives their first year, this first year during which infant mortality is very high, their life expectancy becomes around 40. So people don't have that much time to mature. This is the harsh reality of the times. And the extension of childhood and adolescence that is a characteristic of modern societies is also the product of these much longer lives that we enjoy today, in average. So, as a young leader, left in Macedon as the regent, Alexander represses the revolt of a neighboring tribe and colonizes their land, where a new city is founded, Alexandropolis, a name that indicates his understanding that he is really not a random person, and the first of many new cities bearing his name that would be founded along his life. In 338 and 337 BC, Alexander keeps fighting, leading his own troops or alongside his father. He participates in this campaign, during which Philip crushes the coalition of states led by Thebes and Athens, and finally imposes the League of Corinth on southern Greece, this coalition destined to attack the Persian Empire. In 338 BC, the relation of Alexander and his father probably deteriorates, because Philip takes yet another wife. The Greeks were traditionally monogamous, but polygamy existed in Macedon, and Philip was a big believer in it. He had 7 or 8 wives in total. Alexander's mother was the 4th. Now this new wife is a problem for Alexander, because he has been prepared to be his father's heir, but he is only half Macedonian. His mother, Olympias, came from Epirus. She was Greek, not Macedonian. This new spouse, chosen by Philip, is the niece of a Macedonian general, and if she has a son with his father, this son with 100% Macedonian blood could have a stronger claim to the throne. For a time, as the wedding is approaching, Alexander even takes his distance with his father's court. He flees with his mother. But the wedding takes place, and they reconcile a few months later. Alexander is confirmed as the only heir, and in 336 BC, when his father is assassinated, he is immediately proclaimed king by the nobles of the capital and the army. He is just 20, and overnight he becomes the most powerful man in Greece. Successions in Macedon were often tense, and there was always a risk of pretenders rising. I just told you of Alexander's worries about the possibility of a competing heir. So, out of caution, Alexander begins his reign by getting rid of all potential rivals. He orders several assassinations, including a cousin, while his mother, Olympias, has her last rival, the last spouse of Philip, also killed. Harsh times. But Alexander knows that the death of his father is big news, not only in Macedon, but for all of Greece. He knows that all the vassal states of central and southern Greece only accepted Philip's rule because they had no choice, and that he is probably going to have to fight to preserve his inheritance. So he cannot afford internal problems with pretenders. And he is right. Many states revolt immediately, including Thebes and Athens, the 2 main cities of southern Greece. Immediately, he goes on a campaign to the south, taking only cavalry forces to go faster, and he successfully forces revolted cities to sue for peace. He is confirmed as the successor of Philip as the leader of the League of Corinth. The next goal remains the same: the attack on the Persian Empire. But before that, Alexander wants to safeguard the northern border of Macedon, which is constantly threatened by different tribes. So he spends the year 335 BC campaigning against them, triumphing at each battle. The cities of Greece have signed peace and rejoined the League of Corinth, but they are still very unhappy with the Macedonian domination forced on them. And as Alexander is busy in the north, Athens and Thebes revolt once again, whereas lesser cities wait and see on which side they want to be. The Athenians are more cautious, but Thebes decides to really fight, and that will be its downfall. Alexander crushes the Thebans, and because he needs to set an example, he orders the city to be razed, and he divides its former territory between its neighbors, ending one of the major cities of classical Greece. That's tough but very efficient. Athens is terrified of what has just happened, so it submits again. Now the northern border is pacified, Greece is under control, and serious things can begin. Philip II had already sent a force of 10,000 men into Anatolia to prepare for a larger invasion. They had occupied a bit of land without advancing much, and tried to push cities of western Anatolia that were culturally Greek, but had been under Persian rule for decades, to revolt against the Persians. Alexander takes over the invasion project of his father and gathers a much larger army, a mix of Macedonians and soldiers from various Greek cities, plus mercenaries and troops raised in the vassal states of Macedon to its north, east, and west borders. In total, around 48,000 foot soldiers, 6,000 cavalry, and a fleet of 120 ships. This is a large force concentrated in Anatolia, giving him an initial advantage, but really not much compared with the mobilization capacity of the Achaemenid Empire, which on paper can raise armies of hundreds of thousands and mobilize a fleet of hundreds of ships in the Mediterranean. So let's see how this is going to turn out. The first year of the invasion, 334 BC, is going to be dedicated to the invasion of Anatolia, of modern Turkey. These provinces had been acquired by the Persian Empire when it was expanding very fast. In the 6th century BC, 200 years prior, under Emperor Cyrus the Great. The Achaemenid Empire was organized into provinces called satrapies, governed by a satrap, a representative of the emperor, a kind of viceroy that had a good degree of autonomy as long as they paid taxes to the empire and followed instructions. The number of satrapies varied over time and is not always easy to determine, because the term satrapy applied at the same time to major provinces and also to their subdivisions. Also on the edges of the empire, in northern India or nomadic regions in Central Asia, the rule was indirect and the frontiers not always precisely defined. But there are 20 to 30 satrapies when Alexander begins his invasion. The emperor of the Achaemenids is Darius III, and he rules over an empire that is the largest in the world, and incredibly wealthy, but has already stopped expanding for a while, and is now focused on maintaining its unity. It is so vast, with peripheral provinces prone to revolt, that it is no longer really trying to conquer more. There had been this setback against the Greeks in the 5th century, which was a bit humiliating for the Persians given the disproportion of forces. But the truth is that conquering Greece was not that important to the Achaemenids. Greece was thousands of miles away from the true center of their empire, the plateaus of Persia and Mesopotamia. There were more populated and wealthier provinces, such as Egypt, to keep within the borders. So the Greek problem was secondary. Actually, in 336 and 335 BC, just before Alexander starts his invasion, the satrapy of Egypt has revolted, the last of several revolts. The revolt has been suppressed once again, but the Greeks know it. All of this to say that Alexander's invasion project is certainly bold, but not completely crazy. The Greeks have perceived that the Achaemenid Empire is no longer the invincible power that it used to be. It is a formidable opponent, yes, but one that is on the defensive. And the Greeks have smelled that there is already a bit of blood in the water. Still, as soon as Alexander's army crosses into Asia and starts invading Anatolia, the emperor, Darius III, acknowledges the threat. Persia has not been attacked by a regular invading army for generations, and he gathers troops to counterattack and block the Greeks from advancing beyond Anatolia. This takes months, and meanwhile the Greeks have a window of opportunity to take Anatolia. The plan Alexander follows is to conquer or liberate, depending on the side we look from, the cities of the Anatolian coast. First, these cities are culturally close to Greece. They don't necessarily feel they belong to the Persian Empire. And second, this is a way of denying ports to Persian ships. Meanwhile, the satraps of Anatolia, because the region is divided into several satrapies, try to organize a response with the means they have. And the first large battle takes place in 334 BC, the Battle of the Granicus in the northeast of Anatolia. About a third of the Greek army, a total of 18,000 men, faces Persian forces. The numbers are uncertain. They range from 14,000 to more than 40,000. But modern historians tend to believe reality was more near the lower end of this estimate, meaning that numerically the Persians would have been on par with the Greeks, and quality-wise, Greek troops are much better trained and equipped. Modern historians find this low estimate of Persian troops more credible, more plausible, in particular because of the strategy chosen by the Persian satraps. They choose to defend a river. They try to stop the Greeks from crossing it. If they had had larger and better troops, they would have probably chosen a less defensive tactic. Another reason to downplay the size of Persian troops is that Greek casualties at this battle are very low, about 100 to 200. But still, the Battle of the Granicus is a resounding victory for Alexander. He sends his troops to aggressively cross the river, which is not very deep, and thanks to a good use of his cavalry to disorganize the Persians, he can then engage his phalanxes with their sarissas, their very long spears, that break Persian lines and make them disband. The Greeks take limited casualties of a few dozens, whereas the Persians lose thousands. That's a crushing victory, even though the Greeks may well have had a numerical and qualitative advantage, given that it happens at the very beginning of the invasion. After the Battle of the Granicus, the only opposition faced by Alexander is going to be sieges for the remainder of the year. The satraps are retreating with what remains of their forces, and he can seize the west of Anatolia, especially all the ports that make it impossible for the Persians to station their fleets. After a year, western Anatolia is under control of the Greeks, and now we are in 333 BC. Emperor Darius has had months to gather an army. He has marched toward Anatolia, and the real shock is going to take place in the south of Anatolia, near the border with modern Syria, the Battle of Issus. Here again, estimates of the forces are imprecise. Ancient sources left by Greek authors and biographers of Alexander probably exaggerated Persian forces to make him look even better. Modern estimates indicate an Achaemenid army of 50,000 to 100,000 men. Darius commands personally this army. And this time, it is no longer improvised forces and mercenaries quickly assembled by the satraps, like at the Battle of the Granicus. The Persian army includes 11,000 cavalry and 10,000 Persian immortals. The immortals were an elite infantry unit that at the same time served as an imperial guard, a bit like the Praetorian Guard would be several centuries later in Rome, and they would also contribute to the ranks of the Persian standing army, the permanent army that was always ready to be used, as opposed to other reserve forces that would be raised punctually. So 50 to 100,000 against 37,000 Greeks. That's between 1.5 and 3 to 1. Still a huge numerical advantage, even though it is not as much as ancient authors often said. Again, this battle starts with both armies on either side of a shallow river. Even though Alexander is outnumbered, he adopts a bold strategy and attacks. Typically, armies would deploy with infantry in the middle and cavalry on the sides. But Alexander chooses to advance in oblique order, making his right wing face the Persian left wing before the centers even meet. And he has chosen to reinforce his right wing as much as possible, and he commands it himself. Between high motivation with their leader participating in the attack, excellent equipment and discipline, the Greek right wing makes the Persian left wing collapse and disband, while at the same time Alexander's infantry, including his phalanxes, pin and push back the Persian infantry. With no left wing left for the Persians, Alexander can lead his right wing towards the center, enveloping Persian soldiers and pushing dangerously close to Darius himself, who had stayed at the center behind his troops. Darius panics and flees, first on a chariot, then on horseback, and between the determination of the Greeks and the sight of their emperor trying to escape, the Persians start routing. The battle turns into a disaster for them. Still based on modern estimates, they lose 20 to 40,000 men, against relatively light casualties on Alexander's side, in the hundreds. The Greeks also have several thousand wounded, including Alexander himself, who has been slightly wounded in the assault. But the Battle of Issus is just the biggest military disaster the Achaemenids have ever suffered, at least for now. They have been defeated by a smaller army. Their emperor has fled dishonorably. And the worst is that the Greeks have captured the emperor's family, who had accompanied what was supposed to be an operation of police to repel the Greeks. The mother, wife, and children of Darius are captured. They will be well treated by Alexander as a sign of respect for royalty, and also because they are very precious hostages. The rout of Darius' army opens the way to more Persian provinces, Phoenicia, Syria, and beyond there is Egypt. However, the emperor has escaped and lives on to prepare his revenge. So in short, this victory at Issus is the first truly brilliant, large-scale victory for Alexander. He has used the terrain, surprise, and his aggressive leadership to defeat an enemy that was superior, at least on paper, but slower, poorly coordinated, and less motivated. Now, without much pushback, Syria and the coast of the Levant fall to Alexander. The only major resistance he faces on the way to Egypt is the city of Tyre in modern Lebanon, which has to be besieged in 332 BC. And after that, Gaza, a stronghold that also falls after a siege. By the end of 332 BC, 2.5 years into the invasion, Alexander reaches Egypt. I told you before that Egypt had revolted several times along the 4th century. It didn't accept Persian rule, and that was very helpful to Alexander, because when he advances on Egypt, he is regarded as a liberator rather than yet another invader. So he does what other foreigners have done in the history of Egypt. He tries to be recognized as the new pharaoh, the legitimate successor to a long line of rulers. He will not spend much time in Egypt and will never return after a stay of a few months. But he will leave a mark on the country. First, because he orders the restoration of temples that had been neglected by the Persians. He also commissions a new chapel at the Temple of Karnak in Upper Egypt. So he places himself in the footsteps of past pharaohs. And second, he also makes reforms to install a Greek administration, and he founds the city of Alexandria, a strategically placed port on the Mediterranean coast. Starting from nothing, Alexandria will prosper for the rest of antiquity and to our days. Actually, it is the second largest city in Egypt today. At this point, Alexander has taken about a fourth to a third of the Achaemenid Empire, its entire western third. And this is by far the worst crisis the Persians have lived in centuries. But the heart of their empire has still not been touched, and they still have considerable resources to mobilize. Before Alexander goes on with this conquest, let's take a moment to talk about the man himself. In 332 BC, he is now 24. What does he look like? The truth is we only have a vague idea about it. His height is unknown and seems to have been average by the standards of Macedonian warriors at the time, maybe slightly on the shorter side according to ancient historians, but not shockingly so. That would put him around 5 feet 6, around 1.65 to 1.70 meters. Many sculptures of his face were made during his life, and later they were reproduced, and he was also represented on coins and mosaics. But here again it is hard to really figure out what he looked like, because these portraits were generally idealized, and so were the descriptions. He is often called handsome. The sculptures, the busts, also look really good based on the standards of the time, with a right nose, the typical Greek nose, full lips and full hair forming locks. On coins there is not much detail, and his profile looks more like a generic man. From all this we can get a vague idea of what he looked like, but it is unsure we would be able to recognize him if he appeared in the flesh in front of us. We don't really know the color of his eyes. An old legend says that they were of different colors, but this was invented later. And he probably had a rather light hair color. The various descriptions are a bit contradictory, but they fall in a range between blonde and auburn, certainly lighter than many Greeks at the time, who had rather dark hair. His personality is often described as ambitious, which is obviously true based on his education and actions. And another trait that stands out is an impulsive nature. Not excessively so, because we see him putting thought and strategizing in war and in politics. But it is true that he turns out to be very action-oriented. And he takes risks all the time, including physically when he throws himself into battles. He is certainly a risk-taker. That's a trait he balances with an intelligence that his tutor and various others also note. He learns quickly. He calculates and applies logic to every decision. They may be bold and risky, but they always make sense in their context. Another sign of intelligence is his ability to adapt to circumstances. For example, I told you earlier that his aggressive and risky strategy at the Battle of Issus, or the Battle of the Granicus before, had paid off. But he isn't a one-trick pony that applies the same approach to any battle. Later, in Central Asia or India, he will adopt very different strategies to also achieve military victories. This is why he is regarded as a military genius. He has a set of qualities. such as the understanding of battles, of how crowds move, the charisma, the ability to pivot quickly, that make him an extraordinary general. And also he has luck. When he throws himself into a fight, a lost arrow or a javelin could end everything. But repeatedly, he takes personal risks and nothing too serious happens. At a broader level, if we look at the bigger picture, he also has luck to attack the Achaemenid Empire when it is vulnerable. 50 or 100 years earlier, with another emperor, and tougher, more motivated Persian armies, things could have turned out very differently. He also inherits a war machine almost ready to be used. He has to act swiftly to enforce the League of Corinth, the Hellenic alliance, but his father had laid the ground with his reforms of the Macedonian army and his successful policy to subdue the rest of Greece. So on different counts, he inherits a favorable situation. But still, he achieves extraordinary victories, and the more he wins, the more he appears to see himself as almost a deity, or an envoy of the gods to remodel the world. His ambition only grows over time. Part of it is for propaganda, obviously, and he uses this aura of invincibility and success to impress peoples that are culturally very diverse and have initially no reason to accept the rule of a Macedonian king. They don't even know what Macedon is, or where it is on a map. In any case, he never lets boundless ambition or delusions of grandeur get in the way of pragmatism, probably another sign of his intelligence and logic. Other than that, he is cultured. He isn't a philosopher or a deep thinker, but he knows from his education, history, he has a solid understanding of politics and administration, and it seems he remains an avid reader, even beyond his formation years with Aristotle. On top of his possible relationship with Hephaestion, he marries 3 times. This will happen later in our story. He marries twice for political reasons, with Persian princesses, Stateira, a daughter of Darius III, and Parysatis, a daughter of one of the predecessors of Darius, Artaxerxes III. The third marriage will not be necessary or utilitarian, but seems to have been out of love. He falls for a princess from Central Asia, to the far northeast of his empire, Roxana. They will have 2 children, a son who dies in infancy, and a heir, Alexander IV of Macedon. Alexander the Great is Alexander III of Macedon. His second son was born after his father's death. He also has other children from wives and mistresses, but their legitimacy is dubious. It is unsure they were all from him. But these marriages are still to come, as for the moment he is still in Egypt, and the Achaemenid Empire is far from fallen. So let's resume the story of the conquest. Alexander leaves Egypt in 331 BC and marches eastward, straight toward the heart of the Persian Empire. Darius has had a few months of respite, while Alexander was in Egypt, to regroup and prepare for another large battle that hopefully will erase the disaster of Issus. Again, we don't exactly know what size the Persian army thrown into this upcoming battle has. Ancient sources ranged from 250,000 to 1 million, but modern estimates lower these figures dramatically to below 250,000. Still, the Persians outnumber the Macedonian army, which has not suffered heavy losses in any of the battles of the past 3 years, and is estimated to around 47,000 men at this point. The clash happens in Assyria, the north of modern Iraq, near a village called Gaugamela. The battlefield is going to be a flat plain, which in theory gives an advantage to mobile forces, cavalry, chariots, which Darius has gathered in large numbers, including also some war elephants. But Gaugamela turns out similarly to the Battle of Issus. Again, Alexander has reinforced his right wing and uses it to threaten the Persian left wing, which comprises a lot of cavalry. But this time, instead of charging the Persian left, he taunts it, drawing the Persian cavalry out to pursue him. As the Persian left wing is now moving alone, it opens a gap in the line between the center, made of infantry, and the cavalry. The cavalry that Alexander outmaneuvers, and he charges in this gap. The Persians immediately understand the threat and see the risk of a repeat of Issus, when Alexander had aggressively led his cavalry to threaten Darius himself, behind the center. So they launched chariots to stop the movement, but the Macedonian infantry neutralizes them, and Alexander has space to charge through the gap, straight toward Darius. And once again, the Persians feel a wave of doubt traveling through their ranks. The rest unfolds like at Issus. Darius panics and flees, causing a general rout of his army, which once again was way stronger on paper, but lacked the resolve and combativeness to keep its cool in front of Alexander's bold maneuvers. At the same time, the Persian cavalry has attacked on the other wing, but with the rest of the army now beginning to flee, the Greek left wing is reinforced and holds its ground. Eventually all Persian forces escape, and tens of thousands are killed or captured. The victory is as spectacular as Issus was. And this time, the credibility of Darius is dead. He has fled twice, lost 2 major battles against a smaller force. There is no comeback from this. He manages to escape, but a few months later his own nobles kill him, and the Battle of Gaugamela marks the collapse of imperial power in Persia. The emperor has lost his legitimacy to rule. No other army can stop the Greeks, and Alexander's army has once again suffered minor casualties, a few hundreds only. He goes on to capture Babylon, the main city of Mesopotamia, and a major Achaemenid city, and the conquest of Mesopotamia is followed by the conquest of the original home of the Persians and of the Achaemenid dynasty in modern Iran. In particular, the Greeks take the important city of Susa, one of the capitals, and the ceremonial capital of the empire, Persepolis, which are captured in the following month. Other smaller battles will follow, but in practice the imperial power has ceased to exist, replaced with Alexander, who does like he had done in Egypt. The Persian Empire is a complex, enormous administrative machine, and there is no way he can control such vast lands with an army of a few tens of thousands only. So he places himself on the throne and seeks support of the Persian elite, of the nobility, which he gets. This is when these political marriages with daughters of Darius and Artaxerxes take place, as ways of building up legitimacy and acceptance from the Persians. Also, to seek acceptance by the Persians, he adopts some elements of Persian dress and customs, and he has to confirm Iranian nobles in high charges, which doesn't go without bothering the Macedonians and the Greeks. The task of really taking control of the empire and pacifying revolting regions on its fringes, especially in Central Asia, keeps Alexander busy for 3 years. He is 26 to 29 during this period. In contrast with the 3 previous years that were a period of pure conquest and triumphs, this period is also one of difficulties and plots, as Alexander adopts some Persian customs and often gives precedence to the Persian upper class over Macedonians. Resentment grows among some of his followers, because they see him adopting partially the Oriental lifestyle as a form of corruption. But maybe more importantly, they want their share of the huge cake that has been conquered, and they are not getting it. 2 different plots to assassinate him are revealed during these years, and Alexander orders several assassinations or executions to eliminate possible threats. So there's a cutthroat atmosphere around him, which certainly contrasts with the shiny years of conquest that had come before. Finally, in 327 BC, now aged 29, Alexander decides to resume his conquests, this time with a campaign in India. This new campaign takes place mostly in modern Pakistan, and here again, brilliant triumphs await on the battlefields. Not of the same magnitude as Issus or Gaugamela, but this cements his reputation of invincibility. What ultimately stops this invasion of India is that the soldiers refuse to advance further. By 325 BC, the Greeks have left their land 9 years earlier. They are tired of fighting and not enjoying the fruits of their efforts. So the army comes close to mutiny, and Alexander has to accept to return to Persia, which he reaches in 324 BC. While he is in India, his empire stays united. But the reality is that it is still very young. His rule is not accepted everywhere. The satraps that are still in place have a large autonomy. And this huge state that he has created by conquest and tries to keep united looks also unstable and fragile. He is now 32, so still young, and it looks like his future is bright. He will have a lot of time to organize this immense empire, that stretches from Greece to India, and to prepare his succession on the throne of the largest empire ever. He returns to Babylon, that has a rather central location in the empire, and that he thinks of making a fixed capital. But after all these triumphs, something that seems unthinkable, completely absurd, happens in June 323 BC. He falls ill, and after 10 to 14 days, he dies. The exact cause of his death is a mystery. He seems to have declined for several days before passing, starting after a banquet during which he had eaten and drunk a lot. Ancient sources report a high fever, abdominal pain, and a growing weakness that would have made him unable to speak or move in his last days. A possible cause could be an infectious disease, like malaria or typhoid fever, or maybe complications from old battle wounds that would have gotten infected, or possibly also alcohol-related liver issues, because he had a history of heavy drinking. But poisoning, assassination, cannot be completely ruled out. Historians see it as less likely because ancient poisons caused sudden collapse, not that kind of long agony. Whatever the cause, the greatest and fastest conqueror the world had ever seen disappears almost absurdly at 32, leaving a young empire without an obvious or legitimate heir. Roxana is pregnant, and their son will be born after the death of his father. The absence of a clear successor will lead to a series of civil wars, eventually causing the disintegration of his empire and the appearance of rival kingdoms governed by Greek rulers. His former generals and friends, they are called the Diadochi. His empire disappears, but this is by no means a return to the previous situation. The Persian Empire has been ended, and it will take time before another Iranian empire reappears, the Parthian Empire. Alexander's conquest has spread Greek influence well beyond its previous area, and it isn't just generals becoming kings. It is the language, customs, culture in general. Many cities have been founded. The most significant will turn out to be Alexandria of Egypt. That still bears his name, 24 centuries later. Even for religions, the Greek conquest has caused a blending of beliefs or traditions, syncretism. For example, what is called Greco-Buddhism in Central Asia, or Hellenistic Judaism. The expansion of Greek influence and its blending with local cultures, as well as the redrawing of the political map, is the reason why historians have made the death of Alexander the end of the Greek classical period. After it begins the Hellenistic period, during which major centers of Greek culture appear out of Greece, in Egypt, in the Levant, in Anatolia. And Greek is the language of reference, the lingua franca, in the east of the Mediterranean and the Middle East. And this will last, including when the Roman Empire and the Parthian Empire share the lands that once were conquered by Alexander. with this ends our story for tonight. If you are not sleepy yet, you may pick another one in my library. I'll be back soon with a new adventure. Or you can keep your eyes shut, let go, and fall asleep. See you soon. And in the meantime, sleep well, sweet dreams. Au revoir.